Hello! Let's talk about bans. So, there was an article that went up on the 25th of February, which I believe was 2 days ago on Saturday, by Mr. Jeff Curran, called Stop Asking for Bans. And a really good article. I will link it in the description below. I would highly recommend you check it out. I'm going to be kind of responding to this article. And, of course, I have to put a bunch of caveats at the beginning because it's the internet age and otherwise people take things out of context. This is nothing against Jeff personally. I actually really enjoyed reading this. And it's very interesting the way he approaches it, too, that he kind of presents both sides of the argument where he says, hey, here's some reasons I think, bans can hurt a card game. Here's the reasons I think they're good for a card game. And then he gives his own opinion at the end. So I really enjoyed reading it. So, Jeff, thank you for taking the time to write it. Before you continue watching this video, if you haven't read the article, click on the link, go read it. One, he deserves the view just for the time he took to put into it. And two, I will be referencing it directly, so it'll be good if you actually read it and then know what I'm referencing. But this is not like a person. If I disagree with Jeff in this, which sometimes I will, but sometimes I won't. Sometimes I think he's spot on. This isn't like a personal attack on him, but it's just a compliment that because he wrote an article, I can directly reference one. So I'll be using this as the basis for the video, just talking about bans, and I think it's relevant because I know a lot of folks have been asking for that. And why wouldn't you? It's a trading card game. People ask for bans. So he starts off kind of just talking about, people asking for bans in general, and we go into some of the old cards that got banned, Riku, Guido, Thaumaturge, Gasper, where he was talking about how these decks kind of warped deck design, that, they made the game play in a way that probably wasn't intended by the developers. And he talks about some other ways to accomplish something similar to a ban about Errata. I don't really have much thought on the whole Errata section. I think he's pretty spot on. Erratas are just kind of weird in a physical card game. He uses Suzuhisa as a great example where it's just the tiniest of word differences. It essentially, the card would work the same way to any average person looking at it. It just no longer can infinite loop against itself. Not that we ever even see this card anymore. But, or the Zidane one he brings up where instead of win character, or instead of character, I believe they changed it to the proper text, which is win character. But that doesn't, functionally, the card still kind of does the same thing. So yeah, I understand not really wanting to do erratas in a paper TCG, especially if it were to drastically change the way a card would work. So like Mashiri and Stern Leonis, common thing that was talked about with them is, well, what if they just errated them to say only once per turn or only on your turn or something like that? And would that have fixed it? Well, I'm not even going to go into that. The point is that, yeah, if you are getting into this game and you pick the card up and you go, hey, all right, well, I'm going to do this 3 times. And someone says, oh, it's actually only once per turn. And you would look at the card and say, what? There's nowhere on that. Versus choose as many versus up to as many on something like Alba. I don't know. To me, that's pretty similar. So, yeah, I think he's spot on with erratas. Generally, you probably want to try to avoid that in a paper game. A lot easier in digital because you can just change the text there and then everyone has it. But anyway, let's get on to the ban section that he mentions. So one of the first things he talks about negative impacts is how the negative effect it has on a player, where essentially, he mentions you're a new player, you go to a local, and then you have a card that's straight up illegal, and it's banned. And I don't really put much stock into this line of thinking or this argument, because isn't that the nature of just any game? Like, if there's one thing that kind of bugs me about Final Fantasy as a trading card game, or even the mindset around it, it seems to think it's this special flower that it should operate under rules that no other card game should have to operate under. As far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, any card game that has a ban list, that's going to be part of it, right? If you sign up for a trading card game, decide to go play one, you're going to have to learn rules, and you're going to have to learn which cards are allowed and not allowed. So if you're a player and you haven't looked any of that up, you're just showing up to your locals, would you really feel that bad? I kid you not. So the very first time I went to my locals, I didn't even know how to play the game. I took my deck. I had a bunch of, it was like one of the starter decks I had bought. It was just like the FF10 starter deck. I didn't even know how the game worked. So a guy I went to play against, I said, okay, what do I do? And he was like, oh, well, you draw 5, you shuffle, you draw 5 cards. I said, okay, I don't know what the text on any of these cards means. So I literally showed him my hand. I said, so what do I do with these? And he had to teach me from scratch how to play. But I suppose I would find it strange if I were to go into that mindset and be like, oh, well, I can't believe I didn't know that. Well, of course I didn't know that. I was brand new. So I don't know. I just don't put a ton of stock in that argument of well, it's going to feel bad, if you're a new player. Now, he does mention 2 more experienced players where what if you have Doga's a good example, right? Because he had a full art card. I've got the full art card. You've got this full art card, and then, it gets banned. It becomes worthless. And okay, that is technically true, right? That you can purchase these products and then perhaps they're not available one day, right? And he kind of goes on more about that too, with that being like a breach of trust between the developers and the players. And that, the idea that, well, you can use the cards Square Enix sells. And again, on some level, is there some level of feels bad to that? Yes, I'm absolutely sure there is. At the same time, isn't that just part of a trading card game? And maybe you can say that's a part you don't like and you wish there was a better solution. And if there is a better solution, I'm all ears. But, I mean, that's the nature of it, right? So what's the alternative? That you keep a card that is too strong or is unfun to play against or everybody hates just because, well, it would feel bad to not be able to use it? I mean, that's part of a game. And he will go on that further, again, on the positive side. He starts with the negative side. But as far as the breach of trust with Square Enix thing, I don't know. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not that I don't understand it, but, a lot of modern video games are like that, which is maybe some of the reasons they bug me these days. So Final Fantasy XIV, which I used to play a lot of, I'm kind of pretty much chilled out on it after Endwalker. You cannot play the base version of 14 anymore, right? That game was constantly expansions and changing and evolving and adding new things and taking away things. And to be honest, I don't like 14 anymore. I don't think it's as fun to play as it was back in the Heavensward Realm Reborn days. Now, overall, no, there are some great improvements they have made to that game, but they also took away a lot of stuff I liked. I think healing is a terrible job to play now. It used to be really exciting, and you had an interesting rotation with cleric stance, and nowadays it's so brain dead and so easy, I just don't even enjoy it anymore. Was that fair to me? Not personally, but there's also a ton of players who like the new healing and who like the simpler gameplay, and it's way easier to get into, so to each his own. But I can't ever get back that version, so I don't know, is that a breach of trust? I don't really know how to properly address this point other than that it's going to be the nature of a card game, right? And I'll talk on the shadow banning thing, because he does bring that up later, so I'll get to that. So he has a section where he talks about developer pride, and that a ban represents oversight, and it's, basically a point of having to say, hey, we messed up, we made a mistake. And he even says, now as a player, I don't care about that cost at all, and neither should you. And yeah, I don't either, but it is an interesting point that I wonder what that feels like. I've never designed a trading card game. I've never worked for a big company like Square Enix to do that as a job. That would be fun, right? Possibly. Maybe it's terrible. But I wonder what that feels like. Because to me as a player, I don't take it that seriously. I love Yu-Gi-Oh!, the TV show, the anime. And there's a great YouTube series called Yu-Gi-Oh! The Abridged. And one of my favorite recurring jokes in that is that they have all this super serious stuff, right? You have these millennial items and these shadow games and the fate of the world. And in the Abridged series, they do a good job of making fun of the fact that all of these world-changing events are decided by a children's playing card game. And I can't help but just have that attitude about Final Fantasy as well, is that, this is cardboard at the end of the day. Some cardboard cards, like, this is a children's playing card game. Even if, mostly children don't play it, it's mostly adults. Still, it's a card game for fun. So I wouldn't personally understand why a developer would take, like, I don't know, if their pride is hurt because of a ban, I guess I just find that strange, because that's the point, right? I mean, how many cards are in this game? Let's check. So, according to this number here at the bottom of FFDex, there are 2,617 cards in this game. I don't know if that includes double promos, some are reprints, etc. But, over 2,500 cards in this game. And it's, going into its 20th set coming up this year. Of course, there's going to be oversight and overlap and things that slip through the design. I mean, that's so many cards to test and design. Again, I don't think pride should even be a point in that. I think that's a natural part of it, right? When you're designing that much, when you're doing that much to make cards new or interesting, stuff is going to come up. So I don't know. I wouldn't really know how they're feeling. And here's something, too, to kind of go on that point. If there's another thing that does bug me about this game is that I feel like we have zero insight into what the developers think. So he mentions Riku, and I want to bring up Riku specifically. When the developers put out the ban list, it's, as far as I know, the only time we even get like a glimmer of insight into what they want this game to be. There's no press release. There's no point where like, hey, here's how we kind of see the game. Here's how we want it to go. Very rarely do you get insight. And maybe I'm spoiled because I'm used to playing Dota 2 or the original Dota or Heroes of the Storm. Heroes of the Storm, which, Lord, do I have so many complaints about how Blizzard balances these games. But they will put developer notes out there and why they want something to be the way it is. So even if I personally disagree with it, I understand, well, that's how they think it should be. So this Riku card, when they released it, and my friend, he gets so upset about this. You know, when it comes to Riku, this is a mill card. If you look at both of the effects on the card, that's what it does. Other than the name, now it had a lot of prominence because of its name, just because YRP was a big archetype, job, tribal, whatever you want to call it. But everything on the card is a mill card, and I suppose they thought because Wind was getting so many more activations that it was just becoming easier and easier. But my friend always gets mad at this because he's like, but that's what you made a mill card. Why are you surprised it's milling your opponents? So, you know, and while maybe it was probably, again, was it too easy to mill with this card in particular? Probably, because it's on a backup with the amount of activation you could just do. But I don't know. Should mill exist in the game in some form? I would certainly enjoy that. I would appreciate that expanded design space. But then another thing Jeff mentions is cost to players, which is time and investment. You know, let's say you put all this effort into a Mastery list or your Doga list or whatever, and then it gets banned. And, I mean, does that suck? I don't know. I guess I feel differently about this one. He mentions that he can never play an old favorite of his as a deck that took him to Nationals. That deck had Dataluma in it. And while I do understand that sentiment, like I can understand where he's coming from, I just don't feel that personally. And I'll kind of jump ahead here because he does talk about shadow banning in the positive section, or the pro ban section, I guess you'd call it. And what he means by shadow banning is that cards get shadow banned all the time. And Matisky talked about this in a video I had with him, and I really enjoyed this point where he said, think of all the cards that are effectively banned, even if they're not technically banned. So, for example, let's go to FFDex here, and again, I'll just do search for every card. I'm just going to scroll this first page. Name one card on this list that sees play. On just this first page. These are just the Opus 1 fire cards. The only thing I can even think to consider is maybe these Ifrit for Magissa deck. That's it. So, again, there's 2,500 plus cards in the game. How many do you see in a current meta? Maybe 100, maybe even less than that. So there are tons of cards that, yes, while they don't have an official ban on them, they're so bad, they're so outdated, or they don't fit, or whatever the reasoning is, that you can't use them anyway. And I don't see anyone crying tears for those. Like, I don't see anyone lamenting, oh, I can't use Opus 1 Orin anymore. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody out there. We all have our favorite cards. We all have our cards that, you know, are going to lose their power. But again, I guess I just don't put much stock in that, because isn't that the nature of any trading card game? That, yeah, stuff you played 5 years ago might not be good 5 years later. I'm not saying you have to like it. You can still say, yeah, it sucks. I wish that wasn't the case. I miss, you know, I do. I miss the days when I started. I think the game was way more balanced back then. But is that the nature that games go on and they suffer from power creep, and, you know, they create new cards that tend to push out older cards? It kind of is. So I feel like that's just something you have to accept when you play any trading card game. So I definitely don't see it as a reason to not ban something. Okay, then he brings up something I'm so glad he brought up, because I absolutely have wanted to address this for a while now. And he talks about motivation. You know, there wasn't Nationals, there wasn't Worlds. You just had like R4, Haunted Hotel, re-raises. But he talks about, but the motivation to really look deep for answers to problem wasn't on the same level it will be this year. How many events do we need to collect enough data to warrant a ban? How competitive do those events need to be? And this is something I hear from higher level players all the time, and I have to say this point always really bugs me. So first of all, okay, I'll ask you that too. How much data do you need? Because when I think of Opus 11, Opus 11 was heavily dominated by March Writs in whatever form. Usually it was March Writs with Braska's Final Aeon. It was usually Fire or Fire Earth. You didn't actually need to play Wind because of, I think it was the Lilty that automatically searched the Writs out, which then you then pitched and played with the March. So you didn't need Wind at all. Writs could just come out to the field for free. It was easily the most heavily played deck. It was easily the most dominant. But I kept hearing from people who defended it that, well, we don't have enough data. We don't have enough data because there aren't events. There aren't events. And that point really bugs me because, first of all, how much data is needed? No one ever gives me a concrete number. You know, it has to do such and such in 2 events. And I feel like the goalposts get moved on that all the time. If you look at Opus 16 and Soirees in America, we're dominant. We're everywhere. Look at any of those re-raises, and the top cut is flooded with Soirees. And it won at least 2, I know off the top of my head. I know it won the Dallas one, and I think the Portland one, it was like a Soiree Avalanche mix. And it was in the finals of the Florida one. And in Omaha that I was there at, it was out of 8 decks, it was 6 of them. So again, okay, what's the criteria? Does it have to win an event? Which personally I find to be ridiculous. So even though it floods the top cut and it makes it to the finals and it went, what, does it have to win 2, 3, 4 before then you consider, okay, now I will acknowledge it's a good deck, or that it's a great deck, or that it's too strong, or whatever your thoughts on it. For me, if it makes top cut, that's usually a pretty good sign. No, not always. Again, we've all played those decks or seen those decks that, wow, normally this deck doesn't perform really well, but it made top cut today. But for the list to be flooded with Soirees the way they were, I think we can agree that that deck is solid. Now, here's the other thing that bugs me about it. You could say, oh, well, those were re-raises, those weren't Nationals and Worlds. And to be honest, I find that insulting on some level, because it implies that only if it is the highest of high competition can you accurately judge these cards. Like, I play against these cards every week, whether it's in RVA Weekly or I'm just testing with my friends. Like, I can read the cards. I can read cards that counter them, as can anyone else who plays this game. Unless you're a brand new player and you're still figuring out mechanics, we all know what does and doesn't work against these cards. We all know a Sasano against a board full of Soirees and Edel is only going to kill the Edel. Like, we know that. And so I just kind of find it insulting that it's like, well, no, even though you've played against this deck 100 times, you don't actually know what counters it and what doesn't counter it. Like, no, I do know. I don't need to see mono water in the Xanarkand Open. I didn't need to see it in Top Cut before I realized, wow, Lena playing Leviathan for free is pretty ridiculous. Like, I just find that concept absurd. Well, you know, water having 4 monsters on the board that I can't interact with and then I can't efficiently target is incredibly strong. Like, I didn't need to see that for the 30th time before I finally said, you know what? That's kind of strong. So this point has just always bothered me personally because, again, it to me, it kind of implies that, well, unless it's for Nationals or it's Worlds, you can't really know. I think we can, though. We can all read the cards. We can all play with the cards. I'm not saying we have all the right answers all the time, but, you know, the meta in this game usually settles pretty quickly. It didn't take long for Water to establish its dominance, or for Wind to keep being what it was, or for Ice Lightning to get to whatever power level you think it sits at. Like, I get, yeah. So anyway, that's my point on that is, sure, I am sure Nationals and Worlds, you know, does give an extra level of competition. I'm not saying that, but again, I don't need to see Water take a Materia Cup this season, you know, and granted, we'll have a new Opus, so maybe something will happen, it'll change. But like, let's say we had our first Materia Cup before 19 comes out. I don't need to see Water do well in that to go, oh, okay, maybe Water's actually good. I know it's good. I've played against it a ton. I've played it myself. Like, I know that. So, moving on. And then he talks about card that can be filling a crucial role. It brings up Opus 3 Zidane, which, of course, many people have called the C-Ban. I know I certainly called the C-Ban. Yeah, this one's kind of interesting because I do agree sometimes cards are filling a crucial role in the metagame. You know, I did a video recently on discard, and that I think discard as a mechanic is probably, and I'll say this with quotes, healthy, which is ironic, right? Because we've had discard cards banned before. But ideally, you should have discard decks to prey on control decks and combo decks, so that I'm not going to let you keep all your pieces together to do that. Now, Zidane in particular, I've argued for a long time, if I was in charge of this game, I would, in a heartbeat, ban Zidane and then reprint the card in Ice. Because I think as an Ice card, it'd be 100% fine. I just don't think it should be a Wind card. And that's been one of my issues with Wind for a long time. If you've played this game, you know how strong Wind is. It's the boogeyman, the dominant late game deck. And I don't mind it being that. I don't mind, okay, something's got to be the late game deck, right? Why can't it be Wind? Sure, that can be its niche. I just wish it was, it didn't do everything it did so well. Like, why does it have the best discard card in the game? Ice has no card like Zidane where you can just play it and with no conditions, pull whatever you want out of their hand. There's a few things like Zegzat and Irwin, but again, they're all tied to all these other conditions. Like, if this was an Ice card, no issues with that. Now, that's kind of the, I guess you'd call it the con section or the anti-ban section. Then Jeff goes into what he thinks are like pros for the banned list. And again, I really found the way he wrote this article very interesting. Yeah, first and foremost, playing against broken cards is intensely frustrating. Couldn't agree more. And for me, that's kind of what it comes down to. At the end of the day, for me, this is supposed to be a hobby. It's supposed to be something you do for fun. And I've heard before it's a luxury hobby. Absolutely. It's not cheap to keep, buying packs of cards and new cards and trying to buy Yuffie full arts, right? So if you aren't enjoying yourself, then yeah, why are you playing? And I've gotten there a few times, and I've had to step back and take breaks. During 14, the Stern Leonis meta, I definitely just stopped playing for a while because I was like, what's the point? Stern comes down, the game just ends. And I've kind of made a career, whatever that's worth, out of trying to beat the big decks, the meta decks. So I know how frustrating it is. And there's comes a point, and I've definitely done it more, where it's like, it's just not even worth it. I'm just not even going to play against it. Why bother? It's just not enjoyable. Of course, everyone has their own different level for what is and isn't enjoyable, what they think's unfair, but I appreciate that point. Second, here's where he talks about cards getting shadow banned. He makes a great point. Rampair and Waff in Opus 10, those were considered one of the big three. If you go back and look at the last Worlds competition we had in 2019, Rampair, World of Final Fantasy, and Wind, Water, YRP were the three big decks there. And nowadays, yeah, you don't really see these cards ever. He even brings up Veritas, which is a great example. I love that example, Jeff, because in Opus 8, Veritas was called to be banned a lot because at the time, it was a really punishing card. People would play it. There weren't many good counterplays to it. We didn't have Amaterasu. We didn't have such and such. And because it was dark, if you go back and watch videos of those old Crystal Cups, it was in every deck. If you're playing Water, put in Veritas. Earth, Wind, put in Veritas. Now, nowadays, do you see it at all? No, of course not. So, and that's a good point, too, where, okay, well, nowadays you never see it. So should it have been banned? Well, it's hard to say. I really like to point extra credits made on their Hearthstone balancing video where they said something along the lines of like over 1,000 games, when you talk about like luck, like a die roll or, this card enters, you flip a coin, whatever. Over 1,000 games, it'll probably balance out to about 50-50, whatever. However, players don't play games in 1,000 game increments. They play games one at a time, and they feel the emotional impact of each game individually. So even though Veritas may be worthless now or unusable now, it was ridiculous at the time. Rampair was absurd at the time. March Ritz was absurd at the time. Lena Leviathan is absurd right now. Maybe it'll disappear in 2 sets. Does that change that right now it was kind of crazy? No, it doesn't. Now, you could say, well, don't worry about banning it because, in 5 sets times, it'll be irrelevant after that, which, okay, maybe that's true, but couldn't you apply that to any card? I mean, I've seen so many people talk about the cards on the ban list and say, well, you could probably unban these now. You could probably let this go now. Just saw one today. You could probably unlimit Sophie now, maybe. Okay, but then by that logic, well, I guess you should never ban anything because eventually it'll get power crept away. Like, I don't know. Yeah, that one's just kind of a weird. But yes, I loved his point about shadow banning. And that, again, there's 2,500 plus cards in this game. How many do you see in a given meta? Maybe 100. There's so many cards that are banned simply because they're not worth using anymore. His third point's fine. Don't really have anything with that. His fourth point I absolutely love here, where he says if the devs are more willing to ban cards, they can basically have more design space. They can try riskier, goofier concepts, because then if it's a problem, you just ban it right away. And as someone who's really gotten into Magic the Gathering lately, man, oh man, I mean, there's just some goofy ideas in that game. And there's stuff that you read, you're like, well, that's terrible. And not like terrible, like just like that's unplayable. That's too costly or too whatever. But it's neat, and there's all these random alternate win conditions. There's cards that say, hey, find a piece of paper or find something physically in your room and do something with it. There's ones that'll flip coins. It's when, hey, ask somebody if they think this thing would win in a fight. Just a bunch of goofy stuff. But they're pretty free with their bans over there. And because of that, they get to try all this really goofy stuff. And again, does some of it just go straight into the dumpster and it's never even worth using? Yes, but they try. And I really appreciate that. So I absolutely love his fourth point. Fully agree. I would rather see them go bonkers with stuff if they're willing to ban it. And personally, I think that's one of the reasons the game has felt so stale. I've complained for a while now. Everything is enter the field focused, enter the battlefield. Anytime a new card of the week comes out, I always say, let me guess, it's going to say when it enters the field, and I read it. Oh, look at that, when it enters the field. But part of the reason they're probably afraid of that is because, or they're being conservative in that design approach, is because they're not willing to ban stuff. They seem to want to do it only as a last resort. But again, if you are more willing to ban, do something goofy. Do something like Stern. Okay, we're going to try these effects that just use a bunch of cards from our graveyard. Ah, right, that was a bad idea. We'll just throw them out. All right, well, what if we try it again, but we'll temper it with this thing? Oops, still too strong? Ah, okay, we'll just get rid of it. So I would love to see them be more free with the design space, but sadly, that's not the case right now. And then Jeff absolutely counters his own point from earlier where he says, why bring card value into discussion at all? You know, since baseball cards got introduced, yet their value is mercurial, and it's mercurial and it fluctuates. You don't really know what's, you know, it might have value today. It might have no value tomorrow. I feel like that's just kind of a accepted part of the contract you understand when you buy into it. How much did full art Euphies, signature Euphies sell for this opus? Okay, how much are they going to be worth next opus when the Cloud comes out? What about when Estinian comes out in opus 20? What about those full art Tifas back from opus 11? Now those have gone up because of you can't find opus 11 anymore. Will the Euphy be the same? I don't know. Maybe it'll drop though. Maybe it'll be like, yeah, well, it's not as rare anymore. So I don't, you know, no one can really predict value. If we could, we'd all be millionaires. But so I love that he brought that up. And that pretty much wraps up as far as like him kind of arguing both points. He gives his own viewpoint where he says, for him personally, he thinks there's two situations that warrant a ban. One is oversight leads to a deck archetype that goes against the intent of the game. Again, Riku, Guido, Mashiri. And then I believe he says the other standard 2 is when a card so absurdly strong takes over a meta game. You see 35% or more players at a tournament running the card. Feels like a problem, which, you know, I don't know. You could apply that. Do you apply that to the metagame as whole or individual decks? So, like, if you're running water right now, you're running Leviathan. Is that card too strong? Well, on its own, no. Playing for free, yeah, probably. If you're running wind, you're running Bismarck. You have no reason to not run Bismarck, and that can lead to deck homogenization. But yeah, so I really enjoyed the way he went back and forth in this article, so definitely give this a read if you haven't. So what are my final opinions on bans? And obviously I've given some. I think they're totally healthy. I think they're a good thing. I wish they were approached with a less serious mindset than they are in Final Fantasy. Now, I'm not saying you go willy-nilly and someone shows up to locals and loses to, you know, I don't know, this Noctis card, and the Star Set goes, oh, damn, that card beat me, I want it banned. And then the developers listen to them. But, you know, if a card has proven that it's strong or that it works well, you know, I don't know. I'm a little more loosey-goosey with bans. And my thing is, too, and I this never seems to come up in ban discussions, is there a reason we can't unban cards? So, for example, you know, let's say we banned Dodaluma. Okay, well, let's say we've decided, well, in Opus 17, 18, Dodaluma is actually not a problem anymore. It can come off the ban list. It's giving value to that card now. Anyone who kept onto their copies of Dodaluma, hey, you can use it again. And again, if a card is a problem in Opus 13, and I was kind of talking about this earlier, but then it won't be a problem in Opus 18, okay, so why can't it be banned for 13, 14, 15, and then it comes off the list in 16, 17? Is there a really good reason you can't do that? I've never heard one. I've never heard a strong argument against that. So, whereas right now, the ban list is definitely a death knell. The moment it's on there, it can never ever come off again, which probably leads to this feeling of it being a last resort and being so serious and that, nope, you can only do it absolutely. Whereas again, if it was more free-flowing, yeah, you know what? Mashri's too strong, we're going to ban her right now. Riku's too strong, Sophie's too strong, she's limited right now. And 4 sets, actually, she fits with the speed of everything else, so she can go back up to 3 copies, whatever. So I wish they were more flexible with the list. And I wish they were more just willing to ban things. I suppose I've never really understood why there's such strong resistance to bans in this game from some of the player base. Matisky made the great video on Althea. If you banned Althea tomorrow, Wind would still be the strongest deck, the strongest late game deck that the game has. The deck doesn't just die because Althea doesn't exist anymore. But maybe getting rid of that card introduces just enough counterplay or just enough chances for your opponent to do something, or just one less reactivation on your opponent, or one less card they can loop, whatever, that maybe now instead of Wind destroying a matchup 90-10%, well, maybe it goes to 85-15, maybe it goes to 80% 20. But the deck isn't going to die overnight because it loses that one card. That deck is now just so strong with so many pieces. If you took the water deck, if you get rid of Echidna, the deck isn't just going to immediately die and now it's going to be unplayable. And I don't know, Final Fantasy's meta is weird because you will see these decks that just disappear. So Soiree, for example. Soiree was everywhere in Opus 16. Is that deck terrible now? I don't think so. What card came out that said Soiree no longer works? Now, water's really prevalent, so it can bounce stuff a lot, but Soiree has all enter the field effects too, so they're probably happy to keep replaying that deck. But it just fell out of favor, and I've been watching this phenomenon since, really, I guess, Opus 10. 10 you had the big 3, and then 11 you had Mark Ritz, and then that disappeared for 12's Stormcasty stuff, and then 13 was all Sophie, and then 14 was all Doga Verstale, just Mashri Stern, super aggro. Then 15, Sky Pirates was basically untouchable, and you had the Twins and Avalanche. And then that disappears, and 16's all Soiree. So is it just that they just keep printing bigger threats? People just get bored of what's there? I'll leave that for you to decide. So, yeah, I'm very lax with bans. I'm like, Facard, again, Althea has proven her strength. She's a great example. Bismarck has proven his strength. He's a great example. He's a staple. I would personally also like to see them limit cards some more. So, I understand Bismarck is Wynn's big boss monster. So, I would like to see him maybe limited before fully banned outright, although I'm not going to cry if Bismarck gets banned. And I know he's on the watch list. Sildra is a one where they watched it for so long, and this card is only going to continue to get stronger as you print more and more combos, and it's come to a head in Opus 18 that, cool, I'm going to go fetch out Lena and Leviathan. I got the combo online, baby. So I'm much more lax about it. I'm saying, go ahead, feel free, ban stuff. It doesn't need to prove itself, and only if it literally wins 10 tournaments, okay, then you can ban it. It's not fun to play against. It hampers deck design. I think there's a whole host of reasons you can ban cards. So those are my thoughts. Again, hopefully you haven't listened to all this without reading this article from Jeff. Please, if you, for some reason you have, go back and read it. It's a great read. I really appreciate the thought and effort he put into it. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are. Of course, what cards would you like to see banned? I've actually thought of doing a fantasy ban video where I just list all the things I would ban. Because I would do a wave too. And that's the other thing too. They're so conservative about it. They'll do one card, maybe a year, maybe. So anyway, that's what I think. Let me know what you think. And until next time, take care.